Hello, everyone. This is Solum Literary Press. I'm your host, Riley Bounds, and this is the Solum Podcast, where we discuss and examine the intersection of the modern Renaissances in evangelical literature, philosophy, and spiritual formation. Today, I'm excited to have Dr. Gregory Ganssle on the podcast. Greg Ganssle has been thinking about the intersection of Christian faith and contemporary scholarship for nearly 40 years. He began as an undergraduate by skipping his classes and reading C.S. Lewis. After graduating from the University of Maryland in 1978, he worked in campus ministry on a variety of campuses. Hundreds of conversations with students from a wide variety of religious and philosophical perspectives drove him to a sustained self-study program. Eventually, it occurred to him that he was reading philosophy. Since he had escaped college without taking a philosophy course, he decided to begin with Philosophy 101 at the age of 25. Within weeks, he was hooked. Continuing to juggle his full-time campus ministry responsibilities, he earned a Master of Arts in Philosophy from the University of Rhode Island in 1990. He then went full-time and earned his PhD from Syracuse University in 1995, where his dissertation on God's relation to time won a Syracuse University Dissertation Award. In addition to publishing nearly 36 articles, chapters, and reviews, Greg has edited 2 books, God and Time, 4 Views, published by IVP in 2001, and God and Time, Essays on the Divine Nature, Oxford University, 2002, with David M. Woodruff. Greg is also the author of Thinking About God, First Steps in Philosophy, published by IVP in 2004, A Reasonable God, Engaging the New Face of Atheism, published by Biola University Press in 2009, and Our Deepest Desires, How the Christian Story Fulfills Human Aspirations, published by IVP in 2017. Greg was part-time lecturer in the philosophy department at Yale for 9 years and a senior fellow at the Rivendell Institute at Yale. Currently, Greg serves as professor of philosophy at Talbot School of Theology, Biola University. Greg's research interests lie in contemporary philosophy of religion and history of philosophy. Greg has been married to Jeannie since 1985. They have 3 children, none of whom are philosophers. Although happily married, Greg has a secret crush on Jane Austen. Don't we all?
Yes.
More information will be given in the show notes, including a link to his directory profile on Biola University's website if you want to find out more. So, Greg, welcome, and thanks for joining me today.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, honored to have you. I'll disclose that I was Greg's student for a few years. So he had the misfortune of reading my philosophy papers.
Yep.
So I'm sorry to subject you to that, but I'm glad you came on.
Hey, you did pretty well, so no problem.
Thanks. Alrighty. Well, why don't you just tell us a bit about yourself? Namely, how did you become a Christian philosopher?
Well, the moderately short story is, I grew up in a pretty strong family, and we went to church and did that whole thing. And as I entered the teenage years, that became less and less relevant to me. I mean, I never really rejected the existence of God. I never really tampered with atheism very much, but it was pretty irrelevant as it is for many teenagers. And about halfway through high school, our family moved from Maryland to New Jersey, and I got involved in a youth group with a church, not even our own church, and it was there that I had peers, and we began to talk about the Bible and talk about God in a way that was open and seemed relevant. And so there was a whole series of things my junior year of high school. About halfway through that time, I had kind of a profound experience, or realization that there was too much goodness in the world for it all to be an accident.
Mm.
And it was kind of a flash of insight for me. The I thought God has to be real
Mhm.
and be closely involved with our lives. And so that was a big turning point. And a few weeks later, we were at our youth group went to a Billy Graham movie, and I went forward and asked Christ into my life, and that
Mhm.
started me on this journey. So I was 16.
Mm.
Um, it took me a long time to become a philosopher, as my bio says. I should have known earlier that I was philosophical. I mean, in retrospect, even this insight that changed my life was actually a philosophical thought.
Mhm.
And the music I listened to um, Paul Simon and Bob Dylan. I really resonated with thoughtful lyrics, things about the meaning of life.
Mm.
But it wasn't until later, because of my work in campus ministry, that I began to engage more systematically. And
Mm.
and I just started reading. I first started reading Christian authors who were answering questions,
Mhm.
like the problem of evil. People like C.S. Lewis and Francis Schaeffer and people like this. And then I got more and more um, involved in this reading program, and then I began to take classes. And sometimes the way I explain it to people is philosophy for some people is a little like heroin, right? If you dabble in it, you're going to get hooked, and you might never get over it. And that's pretty much what happened. Not that I have any experience with heroin, but I watch TV and I know about it from that. So
Mhm.
so I just gradually stumbled into philosophy, and I felt like um, I had found my niche, that it really fit the way that I thought.
Mm.
And so when I went on to do my master's, like you said, at the University of Rhode Island, because Jeannie and I were getting married, we were going to move to Rhode Island. We worked at Brown University, and it was the closest place I could do a master's. But I
Mhm.
had no idea that there had been this renaissance in Christian philosophy,
Mm.
and a handful of the professors there were Christians, and they were the ones who directed me towards the Society of Christian Philosophers and the work of people like Al Plantinga and Bill Alston.
Mm.
And they directed me to Syracuse. They had sent students there before, and so they really took my chaotic, confused introduction to philosophy and helped me refine it. So I'm really grateful to the people at Rhode Island.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting that uh, you entered that the scene at the time you did.
Mhm.
Um, it doesn't really seem to be very coordinated. It was pretty organic between everybody, your contemporaries, and you entering the field at that time.
Yeah, I think so. Now I'm kind of a second generation in the Renaissance, what we call the Renaissance of Christian philosophy. The first generation were people like Plantinga and Walter Storff and Bill Alston, and they started writing. I mean, Plantinga and Walter Storff were Christians all the way through, committed Christians, and they started writing in the late 50s, even in the early
Hmm.
60s.
Hmm.
And Austin came back to faith in the mid 70s. And
Mm.
of course, all these people knew each other, and there were more. There were, Bob and Marilyn Adams, who at the time were at UCLA, and George Mavrodes at Michigan.
Hmm.
Many of these people, are no longer with us. Um, and so it really began to take off in the 70s.
Mm.
And I didn't start reading philosophy. I mean, I didn't start my master's until 1985. So I
Hmm.
was a decade later, um, but I benefited from these pioneers. And then, of course, Bill
Hmm.
Alston was my thesis advisor at Syracuse,
Oh, really? Okay.
and it was a real privilege to work with him.
Hmm.
So, so I don't feel like I'm part of the Renaissance. I'm more like riding the wave that others generated.
But would you consider E.J. Carnell as um, part of the beginning of it?
That's a good question. I don't know much about Carnell. Um, he was, geez, let me think about Carnell. He was at Trinity Seminary, or I might be confused. No, I'm confusing that with someone else. Car- was he part of the Fuller Seminary group?
To be honest, I'm not sure. He might have been Wheaton, but that's just a guess.
Yeah. So there were people like Carnell, Arthur Holmes was at Wheaton.
Okay.
Um, and so there were people lurking around. Most of them were in seminaries or Christian institutions. Carl Henry, who was part of founding Fuller Seminary, he
Mm-hmm.
had a degree in philosophy. Um, but it really wasn't. I mean, this happened gradually, but it was when there was a convergence with Plantinga, Walterstorff, Arthur Holmes was part of it, um, Mavrodes, because these people, even though Walterstorff and Plantinga were at Calvin College for many years as faculty,
Mm-hmm.
they also went there as undergraduates.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they were publishing in the top academic journals, and
Right.
so they weren't writing for the church. They were writing for the academic community, and that was a fulcrum that really launched a different phase in
Mm.
um, Christian academic philosophy.
I
Um,
see.
I think people like Carnell and even Carl Henry, who wrote good work, um, were mostly writing within the Christian community.
Okay. Yeah, that's a good distinction. Um, so the second wave, would you kind of include yourself among the group that consists of Douglas Guyvett, or did Moreland kind of get his start in the '80s too?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Moreland started with campus ministry too, with
Right.
Campus Crusade, right?
Mm-hmm.
And he was years ahead of me and was very helpful along the way, right? I had
Mm-hmm.
several conversations with him
Mm-hmm.
um, as I was navigating my course, and Doug Guyvett, and of course these guys are here at Talbot. There's a if we want to, if I label myself kind of second generation, um, it's a very large second generation of scholars
Mm-hmm.
um, that were attracted to philosophy as Christians because of the work of the first generation.
Mm-hmm.
And the first generation, a lot of these people came out of the really good Christian colleges, Wheaton and Calvin, that were very strong in philosophy at the time.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and but there were, I don't know, I can't estimate. I think there were hundreds in the second generation, right? And depending on how you cut generations, I might actually be third. Who knows? Um,
Mm-hmm.
but we really benefited. So there were when the Society of Christian Philosophers were formed in 1978.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it grew very, very quickly, and I joined in about 1987 when I was halfway through my master's. And by that time, I think there were almost 800 or 1,000 members.
Wow.
And so we would go to the conferences, and at the conferences, normally the keynote speakers were these first generation people like
Mm-hmm.
Nick and Al and Bill and Marilyn, and it was inspiring for us. I remember going to a conference. It was 3 weeks after my middle son was born, so I only went for part of it because we had an infant.
Mm-hmm.
Called the Future of God conference up at Gordon College. We were living in Rhode Island, and Dean Zimmerman and Dean was a graduate student at Brown, and we were in a Bible study together, and we drove up to this conference, and that was the first time I met all these people. Eleanor Stump was there, Marilyn Adams. I sat down with Marilyn for like an hour to talk about graduate school. She was so gracious. Um, and Norman Kretzmann from Cornell. But there had to be 100 people at the conference.
Wow.
And a lot were people like me that were in master's programs aspiring to do PhDs. Some of them were doctoral students. Um, and this kind of thing was happening a lot.
Yeah.
So as far as I was concerned, it was kind of mesmerizing that this was happening.
Definitely. Yeah. And the convergence of all that. I wonder if there haven't been more in the past who may have been more isolated because they didn't have the resources that we do today. Um,
I think that's right. I think this is what people have reported when they decided to form the Society of Christian Philosophers. They made an announcement at the American Philosophical Association, and they expected maybe a dozen or two to show up to the first meeting, and 80 philosophers showed up that were interested. Now the Society of Christian Philosophers is very broadly Christian. Anyone who identifies as a Christian can be a member. It doesn't have a doctrinal statement beyond that, and
okay.
that has been helpful to the mission of the society because it's a pretty big tent, and so I think what the founding people discovered was that there were more people that were isolated, and it became really important to be able to have conversations with fellow Christians and fellow theists where you didn't have to defend your first principles all the time. You could move on and do other things, and um, it's one of the great stories of
Mm-hmm.
Christian academia in the 20th century.
Definitely. Um, Now, when you were starting, did uh, did the Evangelical Philosophical Society start around that time, or was that?
That's a really interesting question. Okay, so the Evangelical Philosophical Society actually began before the Society of Christian Philosophers. It was
Oh,
1974, and
wow.
it was I don't know the technical term, like a subgroup of the Evangelical Theological Society.
Oh, okay.
And so what happened was at the Evangelical Theological Society meetings, they would have kind of a slot of meetings for the philosophers, and it was called the Evangelical Philosophical Society.
Mm-hmm.
And that went along. They began to publish the bulletin of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, and that was, I don't know if it was peer reviewed from the very beginning. It might have been, but it was really an in-house journal.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then somewhere around, it must have been when I was in my doctoral program in the early 90s, some of the philosophers like Bill Craig and J.P. Moreland and Doug Geivett and some of the guys at Liberty like Gary Habermas and that were part of this, they decided to reconstitute the society, and they said, let's
Mm-hmm.
make this a serious philosophical society. Let's completely overhaul the journal and make it a real academic journal. And this
Mm-hmm.
began in the early 90s. And Craig Hazen was appointed the editor of the journal. He directs the apologetics program here at Biola. Bill was the first president of the Evangelical Philosophical Society, of this new um, um, reinstitution, so to speak, reconfiguration. And it became a visionary thing for people who were evangelicals and philosophical. And now it's probably the largest group connected with the Evangelical Theological Society. We still meet with them. We also have separate conferences, regional conferences, and things like that. I've been fairly involved with the
Mhm.
Evangelical Philosophical Society. Now, there's a great deal of overlap in the membership between that and the Society of Christian Philosophers, just like there's an American Catholic Philosophical Association, and there's a lot
Mhm.
of overlap between that and the Society of Christian Philosophers.
Mhm.
And so these are not silos; they're kind of different societies with different kinds of emphases
Mhm.
and things. So Phil Christie, the journal, has become, one of the significant philosophy of religion journals in the academic world. Um,
Right.
pretty pretty amazing.
Yeah, definitely. Now, I know you said that you didn't have much of an idea that this movement around you was happening until you got to the Christian Philosophical Society.
Yep.
But when you first met your colleagues,
Hmm.
did you kind of get a sense that, wow, I'm a part of something a lot a lot bigger than I thought I was getting into?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. I remember at Rhode Island, the professor I worked most with, Don Zeil, he became my thesis advisor. He's a Plato scholar.
Hmm.
In fact, his wife is a Biola alum, and but he we met in his office one time, and he just started pulling books off the shelf and saying, you've got to know this guy, you've got to know this guy, look at all this stuff that's happening.
Hmm.
And even though his most of his scholarly work is on Plato, he was very interested in philosophy of religion.
Hmm.
So we did an independent study on Plantinga's epistemology, the is belief in God properly basic stuff,
Hmm.
and and so he really oriented me to the analytic philosophy of religion. I mean, I kind of went into philosophy much more. I didn't know the difference between analytic and continental philosophy, right?
Right.
And but I was very interested in existentialism
Okay.
because of the question of meaning without God, and I'm kind of coming around to the question again,
Hmm.
which is why we did the Nietzsche class.
Yeah.
And um, but I didn't know anything about what analytic philosophy was, and so
Hmm.
Don got me up to speed. I ordered all of these books and started reading these guys, and um, it was like Christmas for you know
Yeah, I bet.
unwrapping all these presents under the
Yeah.
tree.
Right.
And I'm just so grateful for faithful people who blazed a trail for
Hmm.
the rest of us. Um,
Exactly. I am too. Yeah. This is it couldn't have come at a better time, really.
mhm.
Um, with I think we began to shift away in the universities from Christianity or Christian assumptions philosophically. I think back in the 30s, if I remember right, maybe even earlier than that.
Yeah, I think it's much earlier. There's a tremendous book that came out in 92 or 93 by the historian George Marsden called The
Mhm.
Soul of the American University. It's a history of secularization of the university. And
Mhm.
Marsden, was a Calvin guy. He's a historian. And so he hung out with all these philosophers. And um, he's written some very important work. And this book traces how the universities in America became secularized. And it's a very complicated story. And a lot of the influencing factors are things that we are in favor of, right?
Mhm.
So it's not all it's hardly a conspiracy or anything like that. As the country becomes more diverse religiously, the universities had to say, well, we're going to let anyone in our university, right? You don't have to be Protestant. The
Mhm.
universities like Harvard and Yale were distinctly Protestant at the time because Catholics had a very little presence in the colonies when these schools were founded.
Right.
But as that began to grow and as specialization of knowledge began to happen, which really exploded in the 19th century, um, you needed scholars in particular fields. You needed a geologist.
Mhm.
Normally, the faculty, I mean, in the early part, the faculty were clergy. The clergy were the best educated people,
Right.
but they were educated at classic education. They
Mhm.
weren't specialists like geology or math or these kinds of things. And so there are all these factors. It's a great read.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
uh,
Could you repeat the title for us?
Called The Soul of the American University. It's Oxford
Okay.
University Press, George Marsden, Marsden,
Mhm.
and I think it was published in 92 or 93.
Okay.
But I make my students read this in my Doctor of Ministry seminars because they need to know that sometimes we tell the story like we had these great Christian universities and then secular people stole them from us, but it really was more complicated.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that Bill Craig has called it a retreat from the
Mhm.
university as opposed to,
Yes.
I don't know, some like conspiracy or takeover or something.
No, and I think that's right. It's a good word. What Bill says about a retreat, that is a pretty accurate picture of what the church did in response to a lot of these trends.
Hmm.
Right? We
Hmm.
started Bible colleges and
Right.
things like this. And of course, I teach at Biola. I'm happy to have a Bible college or a Christian university. But there, they, we became generally pretty siloed. If I
Hmm.
turn that into a verb, so to speak, we tended to isolate
Right.
ourselves and tried to focus on piety and for some good reasons, but some of the unfortunate side effects is by the time the 30s come around, there were very few serious Christians in the influential universities
Hmm.
doing scholarship in a Christian way. Um, you could count the philosophers who were publicly known to be Christians probably on one hand. Now,
Hmm.
I'm excluding those teaching in the Catholic universities as well, because
Right.
they had a pretty strong philosophy tradition
Hmm.
all through the 20th century, and some of the great research into medieval philosophy emerged in those universities.
Right. Yeah. Um, I've wrestled with exactly how we go about navigating our culture now because obviously, I mean, there are things going on in the university today that we Christians, I mean, we can't uh, tolerate. I mean, I don't think we should send our kids there a
Mm-hmm.
lot of the time. Um, so I wonder like if this push for us, and I know that there needs to be some resurgence at the university level of Christians, of thinking
Yeah.
Christians.
Mm-hmm.
But I wonder if there isn't also merit to the idea that we kind of cloister
Mm-hmm.
in a way to a degree. What would you
Yeah.
say to that?
Well, I think you're right. I think it's a both and, right? Each there are lots of paths, and if we pick a path, it's not going to be right for every student or every teacher.
Hmm.
Um, so on the one hand, I would be against saying we shouldn't have distinctly Christian institutions because the distinctly Christian institutions serve a role that would be lost
Hmm.
if every Christian academic and every Christian student was navigating the secular academy. At the
Hmm.
same time, I would resist thinking Christian students shouldn't go to secular universities and Christian academics shouldn't inhabit those places.
Hmm.
Um, I think the secular colleges can be very tricky um, for students' faith
Right.
because a a Christian student coming out of high school is mostly seriously ill prepared to navigate the environment. And this is the advantage. I mean, here's something I'd like to bang the drum about. This is the advantage of the parachurch ministries at the universities,
Mm-hmm.
Crew and InterVarsity, because you show up and you get into a community of Christians that have already been there navigating the complexities.
Right.
And you know, if a student in the first 6 weeks of freshman year does not connect with one of these groups, the odds are not very good for them maintaining a robust faith through college.
Right.
First 6 weeks are crucial.
Mm-hmm.
If a student does, then the odds are much better.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's just, you know, I was 36 years with Crew and I saw it all the time. So there are resources to help navigate these kinds of things, and the biggest resource is the community in the parachurch groups. It's very rare that a student's involvement in a local church will be enough for them. I think they must get involved in a local church, but you've got to be involved in a campus ministry where you're seeing these people all the time, and you can bring the complex questions to the staff or the more mature students. And something analogous is going to be true for faculty. You've got to find a cadre of believers that share your mission. Otherwise, your mission is very easy for it to get diluted.
Exactly. Now, do you think that parachurch ministries on these campuses, like Crew or the Baptist Collegiate Ministries around here, do you think that they've done a good job at developing their philosophical knowledge and apologetics, or do you think there's more to be done, or what would you say?
Well, it's hard to generalize, and there's always more to be done. I think in general the answer is yes. I think a lot of these ministries have a much more accurate picture of the role of apologetics in the ministry than the professional apologists do. Because this might put some people off, but there are people who think that apologetics is the answer to all of these things.
Mm-hmm.
And in my experience, it's very helpful. I'm a big fan of apologetics, but it's not the answer.
Okay.
It's actually a student's faith depends much more, not a little more, but much more on that student's encounter with Jesus on a daily basis. You know, if a student has a vibrant experience with God through the scriptures, through the church, through the community, and is sharing her faith with fellow students, that is going to be much more important than having a lot of knowledge of apologetics. Now, knowledge of apologetics is really helpful in the evangelistic process and to wrestle with hard questions. And so I think, my experience with Crew is most of the staff on these campuses have a pretty good handle on these things. And even if they're not very interested in apologetics, they know how to point students to things. So, of course, there's all kinds of room for improvement and in all of these ministries. But I think, it's the room for improvement area is much broader than just apologetics.
Okay. Why don't you say a little bit more about that? What exactly would you say would help us?
Well, I think one of the, and I'm finding this here at Biola. So I teach an undergraduate class called the Gospel, Kingdom, and Culture. And I realized that our students, these are juniors, mostly, they don't know how to think theologically. So if we think, okay, how do we think theologically about work? They're going to pull out the verse in Colossians, whatever you do, do your work heartily as to the Lord. And that's a good place to start. But it's a but they don't know how to think about the arc of the Christian story, from creation to the incarnation and redemption to the new heavens and the new earth, and trace a theme like work. Where does work fit into this? In the cultural mandate in Genesis 1, and how that gets developed. So this is something I'm becoming more and more convinced of, that we need to help people think deeply and richly theologically about everything, not just about theological topics.
Mhm.
So I have my students do an assignment. It's a short, paper, 300 words, a theology of knowledge. Give me a theology of knowledge. And I make sure that I say, I don't want you to talk about knowing God. I want you to talk about knowing things in the world, like trees. What's your theology of knowledge?
Mm.
Because if we don't have a theology of knowledge, then we don't have a foundation. Knowledge is one of the perennial locations of cultural movement. I
Mhm.
mean, we saw this. I mean, you could almost trace the history of philosophy around the theme of what do we think knowledge is, and is it possible? Um, and and so I'm more and more inclined to think that this is crucial. Um, on one hand, you could translate what I'm saying into worldview language. What is
Mhm.
our worldview about work? What is our
Mhm.
worldview about knowledge? But I prefer the language of thinking theologically,
Mhm.
because they don't hear it as often.
Right.
Um, and this is going to be important. So let's say you're working in campus ministry at Arizona State University, big school.
Mhm.
Um, how do you equip undergraduates in such a way that 10 years later, when they're working in some insurance agency, they can think Christianly about their work?
Right.
We have to help them do more than just look up key Bible verses. We need a deeper, richer. So I don't mean the academic study of theology, although that could be really helpful.
Yeah.
I mean, okay, how do we think theologically? So that's one theme I think is
Mhm.
really important.
Okay. Yeah, that's very good. That does give us some direction as to how to navigate being in ministry on a very secular campus.
Yeah.
Um, and I'll say too that the pushback, the philosophical pushback, during this Renaissance and the second wave, as you were part of, was very very crucial.
Mm.
I, I've heard it said that um, culture is usually about 50 years behind academia. Um, and I don't know if I actually agree with it. I think it might be about 100. Um, so hopefully within the next 50 years, we're going to feel the cultural effects of what you guys have been working on.
Yeah. Boy, that's an interesting comment. I want to think about that. I think let's call that the time lag. Culture
Okay,
is behind the academy. I
uh-huh.
think the time lag is shrinking dramatically,
Good.
because you think about you think about some of the themes that became really hot philosophically, maybe start with hints in the 60s, but moving into the 70s and 80s. So
Mhm.
on the analytic side of philosophy, for example, you get the anti-realists, people like Hilary Putnam, that are what's true is relative to a conceptual scheme. They're conceptual scheme relativists, or Richard Rorty, and they're both kind of pragmatists. I mean, Rorty's very happy to be called a pragmatist. Um, and on the continental side is people like Foucault that that talk about, there is no knowledge that's not also a power move, right?
Mm.
Well, that has taken very little time to trickle down.
Right.
Right? That is kind of what high school students are being taught. That all of these things are conceptually relative or culturally relative, and there is no privileged, the way Putnam says it, there's no God's eye point of view.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, for him, it's because he didn't think there was a God. Um,
Mm-hmm.
but so I'm not sure when it comes to the big worldview kinds of things, like what is knowledge, what is meaning, and this kind of stuff. I'm not sure we're culture is 50 years behind anymore. It seems really fast to me.
Okay.
I think there is some kind of lag, um, but it's really worth thinking about.
Yeah.
I'll have to give that some more thought.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, in a way, then I'm happy because that means that you're affecting more cultural change quicker. And that was actually what I was going to ask you next. Is
Mhm.
do you think that the Renaissance that you've been a part of, this multi-generational Renaissance, has had cultural effect as of yet?
That's a really hard question. I mean, I should say it this way. That's a really good question. Um, in some ways, no.
Okay.
Um, what trickles down from the culture shaping institutions tends to be pretty much a practical atheism.
Right.
Atheism is considered neutral
Mhm.
in our general culture, right? And of course we've got an increasingly polarized culture on many issues. Um, there's one area where I think there has been some cultural influence, and it doesn't come only from the Renaissance of Christian philosophy, but I think the Renaissance of Christian philosophy has helped contribute.
Mhm.
And that is the area of virtue.
Mm.
There,
Mhm.
there has been, I mean, in academic philosophy, as you know, there's been a resurgence of virtue ethics and now virtue epistemology.
Mhm.
And it began, people pinpointed to 1958 when Elizabeth Anscombe published her paper on modern moral philosophy, and um, kind of pointed towards the virtue tradition coming out of Aristotle specifically, and as appropriated in the Christian tradition and the other religious traditions. And of course, here Dave Horner is all over this stuff.
Right.
But so more and more Christian thinkers have been doing their work on ethics in a virtue framework,
Mhm.
and this has started to get some cultural traction. One of the big instigators, and I'm not sure the degree to which these people are influenced by Christian philosophers, although I know there's been a lot of interchange, is the Templeton Foundation
Mhm.
has funded a lot of research on virtues.
Mm.
A lot of philosophers are getting grants on to do a 3-year collaborative study on humility, for example. I mean, a friend of
Mm.
mine, I went to grad school, he's not a believer. He's
Mhm.
got one of these grants to study humility. And they've really funded a lot of important work so that the conversations about virtue are pretty big in the academic community, and they tend to
Mhm.
trickle out. You see it in television commercials where there's the advertisements are not just, in a sense, crassly utilitarian. They're trying to tie this to meaning and to a robust life,
Mhm.
flourishing, the soul. These kinds of concepts are talked about more. So I think that's a place where there's been a lot of development. I wouldn't want to say it's just the analytic Christian philosophers who launched this. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the Christian philosophers have been part of it. It's been picked up in psychology, and again, I don't want to say it's the
Mm-hmm.
philosophers who influenced what they call positive psychology,
Mm-hmm.
where researchers, I don't know where this came from because I don't know psychology, but someone noticed when we study psychology, we study all the problems. Why don't we study what a healthy person is like? And that's called positive psychology. So the psychologists are working on things like flourishing, well-being, contentment, and and this has been tremendously fruitful. So I think these are very strategic concepts, and the
Mm-hmm.
more they play in our culture, the more hungry people will be for a seriously rich worldview,
Right.
and some of the alternatives will be more clearly anemic.
Right.
So I think that's part of it. I think among philosophers, there's certainly more respect for Christian philosophers now than there was 50 years ago.
Definitely.
But academics have all the prejudices of normal human beings, and there's still that goes on.
Right. Um, yeah, I noticed as you were talking about that even though we have lost our um, well, in the culture, they deem our metaphysical assumptions as Christians pretty implausible.
Right.
They sure are obsessed with ethics,
Yeah.
even though they might be metaphysical nihilists, or
Mm-hmm.
however you like to put that, or naturalists.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that ethics would be more fundamental than things like epistemology or
Oh,
metaphysics? Or yeah,
good question. Yeah.
yeah,
Well, I think again, when it comes to the structure of reality, I think metaphysics is most fundamental,
okay,
and metaphysics broadly construed, right? As of course, including the existence and nature of God.
mm-hmm.
Um, but when it comes to that, you could call that the order of being. But when it comes to the order of knowledge or the order of strategy, I think ethics could be on the top, or more fundamental, because people are so concerned with it.
Right,
You know, the average person is not concerned with metaphysics. And as
mm-hmm.
soon as the conversation gets tough, it's easy to say, yeah, but this is all, this is all just blabber.
Yeah,
But when it comes to ethics, broadly speaking, including virtue and including human flourishing, people deeply care about this. So
mm-hmm.
so it can be the best front door for people to start thinking philosophically or start
Mm-hmm.
thinking theologically.
Right,
Because I mean, so if I'm in a conversation with someone on an airplane and I try to give them the Kalam cosmological argument, almost for sure the person's not going to care. But if I'm able to have a conversation in which a person sees, I have kind of a vision of what human flourishing is like, and I haven't really thought about what that says about reality.
mm-hmm.
It's harder for that person to dismiss the tension. I mean, so what we're trying to do in communication, whether we're doing something Christians do like evangelism, or any kind of persuasion, you're writing an academic paper, is we're trying to raise attention in a person's belief structure. Say, look, this, you believe this, it seems like you ought to believe this.
Mm-hmm.
Now, if the first thing is easy to dismiss, then it's easy not to be persuaded.
Mm-hmm.
Right. So if I say to you, well, you believe that you can't complete an actual infinite series by successive addition, therefore the universe had a beginning, you can say, I don't even know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But if it's like a robust vision of human flourishing,
Mm-hmm.
that's harder to give up. And so we're,
Right.
in a sense, we're trying to help people feel an existential tension that tracks maybe what we could call a cognitive tension in their worldview.
Mm-hmm.
So a person says, look, it's important to be the right kind of person, yet I don't think there's any purpose in the universe. You think, okay,
Mm-hmm.
there's a tension in their worldview. I
Mm-hmm.
want them to experience that tension
Right.
and be motivated to resolve it.
Mm.
Um,
Okay.
so
Yeah.
so yeah, so when it comes to the order of reality, I think metaphysics is foundational. But when it comes to what are the best premises to work from, both in an individual conversation and in cultural work, I think the vision of the good
Mm-hmm.
and ethics broadly construed, not just
Right.
which actions are right and wrong. Something broader than that is the best place to start.
Right. Yeah. And I think that that's the way that the ancient philosophers kind of structured well, their concerns and what exactly they
Yeah,
studied. So,
a lot of them did.
and yeah, yeah. Hopefully, we can kind of make our way back to that, and not just focus too
Yeah,
much on uh, more abstract, disciplines in philosophy.
right.